Welcome to The Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast from BlickRothenberg, the tax, accounting and business advisory firm. This week with Gabby Donald and Stefanie Tremain.
'Twas the week before the budget, and all through Whitehall rumours were stirring, forecasts on call. The red box sat ready, polished and tight, while markets and voters braced for the fight. Gabby and Stefanie, with coffee in hand, scanned every leak, chart and spreadsheet in the land. Will taxes rise? Will thresholds fall? Will nicks confuse us all? One thing was certain, as suspense grew near, next week the Chancellor would make it all clear. So tune in, buckle up, hold your spreadsheets tight. The Tax Factor will guide you through the budget, all right.
Hello, and welcome to The Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast. I'm Gabby Donald.
And I'm Stefanie Tremain.
Well, here we are, a week before the budget, and it certainly feels like it's been a long time coming.
It really does. I don't know about you, Gabby, but the budget feels like one of those long-running TV shows that probably should have ended after the first season and just gets increasingly wild and wacky with each new season. Actually, I think I'm thinking of Lost, which feels quite appropriate, even if I am dating myself with the reference.
So, before we get into any budget-related content, what else has been making the tax headlines this week, Steph?
The Tax Factor. Headlines.
There's a growing chorus of voices looking for stamp duty to be scrapped altogether. Property experts, including high-profile figures like Kirsty Allsop, have labelled stamp duty a sin tax on home buyers. Their argument is pretty simple. The tax discourages people from moving, locks older homeowners into properties that no longer fit their needs, and freezes up the housing market. What's being suggested instead is a national annual property tax levied only on homes worth more than £500,000. Some models suggest a rate of about 0.54% paid each year rather than as a lump sum when you move. Supporters say this would make the system fairer and stop penalising people for wanting to get on or move up the property ladder. But as is usually the case with these things, there's a big catch. This kind of annual tax risks hitting older homeowners in high value but mortgage-free homes, especially in London and the southeast. These people are asset rich, cash poor, and could suddenly find themselves facing yearly tax bills several £1,000s higher than what they're currently paying. Our second story is all about the professional world of tax advice and a major warning from the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. The government is proposing that all tax advisors must register with HMRC and, more controversially, face penalties based on tax errors in their clients' returns, even where the advisor themselves hadn't acted dishonestly. There's also talk of introducing a strict liability criminal offence for failing to disclose certain tax avoidance schemes. Strict liability means intent wouldn't matter. If you didn't disclose it, you'd be at risk, full stop. The ICAEW's position is pretty blunt. These proposals could make the UK, and I quote, the most difficult tax environment in the OECD for advisors. They fear that many experienced professionals may simply stop taking on complex work, refuse higher risk clients, or leave the sector altogether, which in turn could push prices up, limit access to advice, and ultimately harm tax compliance rather than improving it.
That sounds pretty horrendous, Steph. I think this is going to be something that is going to be discussed a lot in future episodes of The Tax Factor. The proposals to mandate that tax advisors register with HMRC are currently very broadly defined and appear to set HMRC up in the role of the regulator. This raises some really significant questions in terms of how such measures would work in practice, as they seem to cover a section only of the tax advisory market, focusing on advisors that interact with HMRC, but not those that don't. So actually, although HMRC are targeting these measures at potentially improving the tax advisory market, it's unlikely that this type of regulation would actually impact the so-called bad actors. Also, the Chartered Institute of Taxation has raised concerns that decision-making about the registration status of tax advisors appears to actually rest with individual HMRC officers, and this could not allow sufficient safeguards. Therefore, you could have a consequence whereby if an individual HMRC officer took a decision, it could lead to disruption for advisors, for their business, for their clients, if that decision happens to be incorrect. Given all of these outstanding questions, an introduction in 2026 seems wholly unrealistic. And this is before we actually even consider the breadth of the proposals. At the other points that you raised around criminal offences, actually, under the measures intended to tackle promoters of marketed tax advisors. These are, again, potentially very broad measures. I know a number of professional and industry bodies have raised very significant concerns about the scope and breadth of these proposals, particularly highlighting that actually the criminal offences and the promoter notice that can be issued could impact the ability of legitimate businesses to supply services if they could perhaps unknowingly be providing services to a suspected promoter. Is this about reducing avoidance? I think we have to ask ourselves, and improving standards. The measures at the moment seem really quite confused.
Well, confused is kind of the order of the day at the minute, isn't it? Our final headline this week, it looks like HMRC are gearing up for a much more aggressive approach to enforcement. Reports suggest HMRC is in the middle of recruiting thousands of new staff to increase investigations, widen compliance activity and shrink the so-called tax gap. HMRC has also indicated it will start reporting more tax lawyers to their professional regulators where they believe legal privilege is being used to shield aggressive tax planning, which represents a noticeable shift in how HMRC deals with the legal profession, and it's causing increasing concern among tax lawyers who argue that privilege exists for a reason. For taxpayers, particularly those using complex structures, this means more scrutiny, more inquiries, and a heightened need to keep their documentation watertight.
Which is probably something that is good practice anyway, but it's a good reminder, I think, for all of us. Thank you for that roundup, Steph, and on to our main topics now for today.
Well, as Tom signed off with last week, it is indeed the night before tax Christmas, as the last tax factor before what feels like the world's longest ever budget.
So what do we think we can expect from the budget? I suppose is the question on everyone's lips.
What can we, what can't we expect? I think expect everything and expect nothing at the same time. Back in the summer, rumours were rife that capital gains tax would be targeted. CGT is currently charged at a top rate of 24% for residential property and other chargeable assets, and up to 32% on gains from carried interest. And there was speculation that CGT rates could be aligned with the 40% income tax rate, which is the higher rate at the moment, not the additional rate, the higher rate in the middle, which would be a big leap, although that was also the case back when I started in tax several years ago. Main residence relief was also the subject of huge speculation at the same time. Now, main residence relief is the relief that exempts the sale of your main home from capital gains tax. And people were wondering, is the Chancellor going to scrap the relief altogether? Is she going to restrict the relief? But it all seems to have gone a bit quiet on that front recently. And it could be because the problem with CGT, and the reason it isn't usually on any Chancellor's radar come budget time, although in the profession we are always constantly expecting it to be increased, is that it doesn't actually bring in that much money. It's relatively easy to avoid because you just don't sell things. And given the way the markets have seesawed recently, thanks in large part to Rachel and the ongoing uncertainty caused by the budget, if you sell an asset at a loss, you can offset that loss against other gains. And for main residence relief, the Treasury would have to be careful to balance what they would anticipate are increased tax take with increased administration for taxpayers and HMRC. Because as with a lot of reliefs, it doesn't exist just because the government feels generous. It reduces the admin that would otherwise arise if every person who ever sold a house that they'd lived in had to report that sale to HMRC. And also, she increased CGT rates a little bit last year. So would she really revisit them again 12 months later? I don't know.
It's going to be interesting because it feels like through the Labour Party manifesto and some of the comments that have come directly from Rachel herself and from other government sources, she really has limited her options over, recent weeks. It's going to be interesting because she may not have a huge number of options available to her.
Exactly. And that's why IHT is the other one on the possible hit list and on the rumour mill. And this one has just run and run and run all summer and right up to today. Will they extend the 7-year window for potentially exempt transfers? Will they remove the exemption for regular gifts made out of surplus income? Again, I would be surprised if IHT isn't addressed in some way, mostly because it's perceived as a vote winner for Labour, although as we know, less than 5% of estates actually pay IHT, so again, doesn't bring in loads of cash. But again, as with CGT, these exemptions and reliefs don't exist out of generosity, but practicality. Tracking every birthday present, every family dinner, because the gifts out of income exemption has been abolished, would be almost impossible and only increase HMRC's workload. We've also had changes to stamp duty rumoured, which of course just ground the property market to a halt. NIC changes, income tax rises, which is the one thing I think generally most people thought, hooray, that's sensible and simple. But if you read current press, That's also been put on the back burner again. Changes to pension relief, good old fiscal drag, a mansion tax, a new pay per mile scheme for electric vehicles, a new exit tax has been mooted. Why would we need an exit tax? Why would anyone want to leave the UK right now? We just couldn't, I'm at a loss as to think why anyone would want to leave. Anyway, despite all this speculation, will she do this? Will she do that? My hope is that whatever changes are introduced, keep one eye on common sense and acknowledgement of HMRC's own limitations and the need to make the UK an attractive proposition for businesses, growth, and individuals from around the world, which is a topic we will be covering later on in this podcast.
Thanks, Steph. The options really are quite limited. I mean, particularly that point that you raised about the need for any tax raising measures to be something that the government can implement quickly and are administratively practical, particularly when you think about the fact that ultimately HMRC have to have the right systems and processes in place to actually collect the tax. It's certainly going to be interesting to see what happens. But of course, we've been speculating here and there's still a week to go. And it feels like, to be perfectly honest, the commentary around this is changing almost minute by minute. So it will be interesting to see what actually happens. And at the 11th hour, of course, after all of this speculation, just when we thought they'd mooted every possible tax, exhausted every possible angle to raise taxes, what do we get?
The Milkshake Tax.
Yay! The Milkshake Tax. Of course. Why not? Why wouldn't there be a milkshake tax? So those among us who are not familiar with the milkshake tax, this actually refers to the proposals to strengthen what its official name is the soft drinks industry levy. It's more commonly referred to as the sugar tax. In addition to reducing the gram per 100 millilitre threshold at which the standard rate of the sugar tax applies, the proposals are also suggesting that the current exemption for milk-based drinks should be removed, as well as the exemption for milk substitute drinks, e.g. soya, almond, oat drinks, etc. Whilst it's planned that there'll be an allowance for naturally occurring sugars, so, for example, lactose in milk or sugars derived from the principal ingredient in milk substitute drinks, added sugars could cause the product to be taxed. Step in milkshakes. As we know, additional costs and taxes in retail often end up being passed on to end consumers. So the removal of the exemption from sugar tax for milk substitute drinks, milk-based drinks, could cause an increase in the price of milkshakes for consumers. As a side note, this proposal will add complexity to our already very complex tax system, as it would mean applying a standard rate of tax, sugar tax, to products that are subject to a zero rate of VAT. Although these are different taxes, creating new and different definitions that run alongside each other flies in the face of simplification. It's certainly arguable that introducing different definitions in this way will make it harder for manufacturers and producers to actually implement the tax. Some would argue that the VAT rules concerning milkshakes and milkshake preparations are already complex enough, with chocolate-flavoured milkshake powder zero-rated as a cocoa preparation, would you believe, but the banana flavour being subject to 20% VAT. So do we really need to introduce a whole new set of tax rules? It will certainly be interesting to see whether the public and the press are willing to swallow this one, given the fallout that some of us may remember with pasty tax U-turn as part of George Osborne's Omnishambles budget.
Yes, I remember it well. Thanks, Gabby. It's interesting to hear the science behind the headline, although disappointing to hear that, as always seems to be the case, if this is introduced, it's just going to mean more complexity.
Next, and finally, we're going to discuss that old favourite, growth, and a little bit of HMRC service levels thrown in for good measure. And the reason this has come to our attention is that the House of Lords have recently debated the impact of economic and tax policy on growth, jobs and prosperity.
Yeah, and quite good timing, given most of the criticism levelled at the Chancellor and the various budget rumours is that currently the UK is just not attractive to entrepreneurs, businesses and wealthy individuals. And the UK needs these people. We need them to hire UK staff, pay UK wages. We need them to base their businesses in the UK, send their children to schools in the UK, and of course, pay some UK tax.
Yeah, it's fair to say the briefing published ahead of the debate doesn't make for particularly happy reading. It refers to a report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation looking into the cost of living in 2025 for lower income households. Some of those findings included that in the 6 months to May 2025, an estimated 7.1 million households were going without essentials, with food being the most skipped on essential. 4.4 million low-income families were behind on at least one bill or credit commitment, and annual disposable income was around £1,000 less for these households in 2025 than it was in 2022.
That is really shocking, and I'm sure it makes it even harder reading if you're the first Labour Chancellor in around 15 years. So what does the briefing suggest could be the answer, Gabby?
The briefing references a September 2025 article by the Institute for Government that, somewhat predictably, if you understand economics, cautions against relying on taxes targeting wealthy individuals, as although there are ways to improve revenues from these groups, attempts to raise substantial sums would be, and I quote, risky and unpredictable.
Because they can leave the UK and also usually manage their finances and tax planning, I imagine.
Exactly. Growing the economy is a significant part of how we can help those on low incomes. To support growth, the Institute for Government report highlights the need for bolder and more holistic reform of our main taxes, including property taxes, VAT, and greater harmonisation of income taxes. I think most advisors would broadly agree that large-scale reform is needed, but this really will be a multi-year project. So I'm not going to hold my breath to see any developments of that type at the budget, especially bearing in mind the need for politicians of all stripes to appeal to their base means that actually it's probably going to be quite a long time coming before we see that scale of reform. The IFG also highlights the need for a clear tax strategy that is linked to and cohesive with non-tax policy changes. We often hear politicians talking about requiring the regulators to prioritise growth. But what we need to see here, I think, is tax policy looked upon as an integral part of future regulatory change. In addition to tax policy, another growth lever, of course, that we can pull to make the UK an attractive place to invest and do business is actually by looking at how HMRC administer taxes. By this, we're talking about the ease with which businesses and individuals can deal with HMRC. Steph, you and I have both got some examples of how HMRC delays massively impact taxpayers, and this difficulty can put off prospective investors, businesses and individuals.
Yeah, we have delays in obtaining UTRs, which is the reference number you need to file a tax return and pay your tax. We've got post going missing or arriving late, which just leads to protracted conversations with the revenue around deadlines and penalty appeals. The tax system is particularly clunky and unhelpful for non-residents. I have a friend, a real-life example coming for you right now, who lives abroad and can't find her UTR. If she rings HMRC, they'll post it to her, which means she'll never receive it, pretty much. If she tries to use the online system, she gets an error message and a suggestion for an alternative method that can only be used if you live in the UK. Now, I'm sure this seems like a small inconvenience, but who wants to deal with these frustrating inconveniences just to get your tax sorted? Most people just want an easy life, and these complexities disencourage people from investing in the UK, coming back to the UK, or moving here in the first place. A business will not want to set up a UK branch if none of their executives want to live here, and that has a knock-on effect for the economy.
Yeah, I completely agree, Steph. And I think, a lot of my experiences chime with yours. Whilst sometimes individually you'll deal with HMRC officers who really do go the extra mile and try to help the individuals and businesses that we're working with, you certainly encounter a lot of, I think, systems and process problems where, for example, HMRC systems don't necessarily speak to each other particularly well. We have a lot of problems, certainly on the VAT side, where UTRs actually impact other taxes. So your ability to register or form a VAT group is also adversely impacted by the lack of a UTR. We also see a lot of problems and delays in VAT repayments, which can actually have quite serious cash flow implications for businesses. So I think certainly there is a lot of scope in terms of improving the slickness of tax administration and the taxpayer experience, I think, to help encourage business and the UK a much more attractive place.
Yeah, agreed.
BlickRothenberg, celebrating 80 years.
So, That's about all we've got time for this week. My thanks to Steph for joining me on this episode.
Thanks, Gabby. It's been a pleasure. And next week, drum roll, it's Budget Week, aka Tax Christmas. And of course, we have a special episode of The Tax Factor hosted by Heather Self and our Head of Property and Construction, Heather Powell, to go through the gifts or lumps of coal the Chancellor has left in the country's Christmas stocking. We'll be recording it just after the Chancellor sits down, and it'll be available a day earlier on Thursday, the 27th of November. So look out for it on your regular platform, and if you've not already subscribed, so you get notified as soon as it's released.
This year, BlickRothenberg is taking our budget coverage to the next level. For the first time, we'll also be broadcasting an exclusive live stream from our Covent Garden studios on Budget Day at 3 p.m. Hosted by journalist and broadcaster Simon Gompertz, the live session will feature Nimesh Shah, CEO of BlickRothenberg, alongside a panel of our leading tax and economic experts. They'll be discussing the Chancellor's announcements and their analysis of the budget detail. You can register to access this exclusive live stream on the BlickRothenberg website. Just follow the links on our homepage.
If you want to stay ahead of the latest tax news and insights, you can head over to the BlickRothenberg website, where you can also sign up for updates on key topics.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating or review. But from us, it's goodbye and have a good weekend. Goodbye.
That's The Tax Factor. Since launching in August 2023, we've become the UK's top tax podcast in the UK podcast chart. Join us every Friday for expert insight on the latest tax news. Subscribe on your preferred podcast platform or listen direct on the BlickRothenberg website, where you can also find the latest updates and analysis. The Tax Factor from BlickRothenberg. Copyright 2025.